Once again, hi, I am Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service down here in Hancock County, Mississippi. And I'm going to be talking to you about high tunnels and their use in producing vegetables and fruit here in the southeastern United States, Mississippi in particular. May have a few notes about some other things along the way. So just to go ahead and get started, what is a high tunnel? A high tunnel is essentially an unheated greenhouse type structure. Much like a greenhouse, it increases the temperature inside of it using the greenhouse effect. Light comes in, heats up the air inside, and so you get an increased temperature inside of it. Kind of unlike a greenhouse, we don't have in a high tunnel generally any heating or cooling systems other than passive ventilation. So as a structure, high tunnels are generally going to be constructed of a metal frame. There's certainly some exceptions to that where people have built high tunnels using PVC or other materials like that. And generally, our high tunnel is covered over with a 6 mil greenhouse grade plastic. And they are considered, again, unlike a greenhouse, they're considered a non-permanent structure. Because they are considered a non-permanent structure, they don't tend to have any impact on your tax bill in terms of your property taxes. So that's that can be considered another advantage of using high tunnels, is that putting one on your property is not going to affect those property taxes. They do tend to have high ceilings in comparison to a lot of greenhouses. Part of that is about ventilation, but really we need to get into and out of those high tunnels very easily. And so having those higher sides or higher roofs tend to be a benefit there. And in greenhouses, generally speaking, we're going to be growing plants in pots. Oftentimes, we're going to be using benches inside of a greenhouse. In a high tunnel, we tend to be growing in the ground. Sometimes we do have raised beds inside, but that's going to be a major difference. Occasionally, in high tunnels, people will use portable heat sources, things like propane heaters for the very early spring or late winter. And when we want to adjust the temperature inside of a high tunnel, what we do in order to make that happen, and you can see there in the image that's on this slide, when we want to reduce the temperature inside that high tunnel, we can raise the sides of it. That's going to allow air movement through and a lot of that heat to escape. And of course, we can raise and lower the end caps that are on that high tunnel as well. It makes it very much more similar to a field environment once we raise the sides and the end caps. So the virtue of growing in a high tunnel, or the reason for having that high tunnel, is that because we can raise the temperatures in the early spring and in the late fall, we can start to grow plants a little bit earlier than we would be able to in the field. So generally speaking, for high tunnels, they're going to allow us to get into production about 2 to 3 weeks earlier than in field plantings. Kind of as an extension of that, if we're growing those vegetable plants in the fall, then we're going to be able to maintain those plants a good bit longer, because we're going to be able to use that high tunnel as a frost protection tool late in the fall season. In addition to that, because of the increased air temperature inside of a high tunnel, we're also going to generally see an increase in the rate that plants grow. And that will generally allow us to, even if we plant on the same date inside the high tunnel, allow us to get a little bit of an earlier harvest because of that increased or more rapid plant growth. For the producer side of that, there are a lot of advantages to being a little bit earlier in our production. One part of that being that you start to see a little bit of cash flow, a little bit of income from your production a little bit earlier, can maintain that a little bit longer, and have that money coming in over a longer period of time. The other side of that is the first person to market has an advantage. So if you can get your vegetable products to the market at a time when other producers are not able to do that, then you're going to be able to charge a premium price for that produce. People are just going to be willing to pay more if you're the only person who has that produce at the market. So that's can be another big advantage for growers in adopting high tunnel production. Very often you're going to see an increase in the amount of production you're going to get inside that high tunnel. That's going to give you a higher income per unit of area. And part of that is your relationship with customers. A lot of customers really like to see that production, and if they enjoy that product that they're going to get early in the season, they're very likely to come back to you out of loyalty to their farmer. So, of course, as I mentioned, we might see an increase in yield. We also can see an increase in the quality of the product for a range of reasons. Particularly, there are some advantages in high tunnel production when we start talking about insects and diseases. So what this really comes down to in terms of growing is, when can we plant in the spring? That is generally for us going to be a function of when our median or average last date of freeze is going to be. And that's going to be different for where you happen to be. In Mississippi, or if you're listening from another area, then you need to kind of pay attention to when the average last freeze is going to be in your area. And after that is when you're going to be able to get plants out in the field. But again, we can march that back several weeks because the temperatures in the high tunnel are going to be higher. Not only does it increase the air temperature, but really importantly for establishing new plants, you see an increase in the soil temperature as well. So paying attention to that last freeze date and then using that as a measure for when you're going to be able to get those plants in is really useful. One of the things that's really valuable to say at this point is there really is no better teacher for this kind of practice and when exactly you're going to be able to start that plant off in the high tunnel than personal experience. Of course, other growers, if they're willing to share the benefit of their experience with you, is great as well. But adapting to high tunnel production for your area is going to take a little bit of trial and error just to make sure that we get those plants in as early as we can, but without risk of damage from a freeze. So some things you really want to pay attention to: when is that last freeze date, as well as when is your first frost date. So when we think about the fall season, our limiting factor there is going to be when on average we tend to have that first frost. Here down where I am in the very southern part of Mississippi, we tend to have till about the middle part of November. But certainly if you're in northern Mississippi, or if you're in a more northern area than that, your first frost date is going to be a good bit earlier than what mine is. So in addition to that, we want to know what the days to maturity are for the varieties that we're growing. Different varieties of crops very often have potentially widely varying amount of time that they require to get to maturity and to get into production. It's very important to know that and to use that as a measure for when you're going to be able to get that crop in. and particularly for the fall season, making sure that you're going to get production before you see that frost date. Your weather is going to affect the schedule. If you have really sunny weather, if you have really cloudy weather and a lot of rain, all of that is going to have an impact. And for producers, certainly, and even for home gardeners, you may want to be prepared for what kind of what you're going to do if you have more production that you can sell. Then getting into some of the value-added product is a really good idea. But you also want to have something to fall back on if you do have a produce shortage. And as I mentioned, there really is no better teacher than experience and trying things and seeing how they work for you. So I just wanted to use this slide kind of as a way to demonstrate to you a little bit about plant growth in high tunnels. Again, we're normally going to be able to start those crops 2 to 3 weeks before we would outdoors. But even if we start the plants at the same time, being inside the high tunnel and having those increases in temperature, both air temperature and soil temperature, are going to have an impact on plant growth. And so I have this figure here, and those 2 lines that you see on it are what I'd really want you to focus on. And you can see the bottom line there, which basically it's a measure of how tall the plants were. Those plants were put in at the same time, but you can see that there's a difference in the growth of those plants between a high tunnel and field production. So inside that high tunnel, we wound up in this case with larger tomato plants because there was a pretty good difference in temperature between the high tunnel and the field. Now, some things that you want to consider when we're talking about getting into high tunnel production. Part of that is that you want to consider the cost of the high tunnel because putting a high tunnel down in an area is going to make that area really valuable ground for you. There's there is a significant cost that comes along with that. So in order to make that area really productive, we really need to be growing a high gross value crop. So very popular in high tunnels are vegetables like tomatoes and cucumbers. Fruit like blueberries and blackberries have the potential to be a very high value crop. And in that way, they make the production cost or the additional production cost involved with the construction of that high tunnel worth your time. So ideally, of course, we do want to see an increased yield. We want to be adjusting the crop into that high value market window again, so that the cost that goes into getting in that high tunnel is going to be returned by the benefit we see from it. And you do want to consider, as well as that, there is going to be some labor associated with managing growing in a high tunnel. Most significantly with that, aside from just building it, maintaining temperature in a high tunnel really requires raising and lowering the sides of it at an appropriate time. And so there is going to be some labor that goes into getting out there and rolling up the sides when it's time to roll them up, and putting down the sides when it's time to put them down. So that's just another thing that we want to consider when we're considering putting in that high tunnel. So when we are talking about putting in a high tunnel, we want to first of all consider the site where we are going to put that. And a lot of these considerations are really similar to what we would see for a greenhouse. So we want an area that's level. It's going to be easier to grow on. We want an area that has full sun exposure. We don't want to have any obstructions like power lines or trees in the area that are going to make it difficult to get it in there. And here in Mississippi, generally speaking, we want the long side of the high tunnel, or generally we want to orient that high tunnel north to south. And that's just to prevent shading over the course of the time of year. when that high tunnel is being really effective for us. One note that I think is very important, and we'll talk about irrigation just a little bit, is that it is important to consider the placement of that high tunnel in relation to an available water source. So we're going to have an irrigation system in there. Um, and so you want to make sure that you have the ability to get water to the location of the high tunnel. If you're going to be digging, then it's a good idea to make sure you check for any underground lines prior to putting the high tunnel in a location. We don't want to have any problems with power lines or gas lines. So you know, call before you dig is the message that goes into that. And kind of another additional comment there. High tunnels can be damaged by strong winds, just like any other structure. So making sure that it's, you know, you're not in an area where you're going to have a real problem with that. You're not putting it in an area where there's kind of a wind tunnel effect. You want to make sure that it's well built to ensure that you're not going to have problems with a high tunnel flying off. And you do want to be conscious that if you are going into a time when you know you're possibly going to have a high wind event, and I think specifically living down here on the coast, that you know, if you know a hurricane is coming or something like that, oftentimes the plastic is removed from the high tunnel in order to prevent the kind of wind damage that you see down there in the bottom image. So talking about temperature in a high tunnel, that is going to vary according to the intensity of the sun. That greenhouse effect is really what's giving us the difference in temperature. And so because of that, you are going to see some variation depending on weather conditions, the time of day, and the time of year. Generally speaking, on a cloudy day, it's going to be cooler than it will be on a sunny day. It's going to be you know, cooler in the morning and the evening and then afternoon, and generally it's going to be cooler in the spring and fall than in the summer. And a tool that's very important to help you maintain the temperature that you want inside your high tunnel is a minimum and maximum thermometer. That's just going to not only tell you what temperature it is right now, but it's going to tell you what the lowest temperature you're getting to is and what the highest temperature you're getting to is. And that's going to help you judge, you know, whether you need to get those sides rolled down, you know, for cold protection, whether you need to get those sides rolled up to drop that temperature a little bit when you're at the extremes of that minimum or maximum. One thing that you can note in the top image there is another graph. And what that shows is actually a measurement of the differences in temperature from inside and outside a high tunnel. That represents an average across 4 different locations in Mississippi. And you can see, because those measurements kind of go across 2 years, that there are periods of time when you're seeing big differences in temperature and periods of time when you're not seeing huge differences in temperature. And there's really a kind of simple explanation to that. During those times that you see those larger spikes, that's when you're rolling down the sides of that high tunnel more frequently because of cold temperatures outside. And you know, kind of as another aspect of that, you can see that you know, while you might see on average maybe you know, a 3 to 4 degree difference in terms of air temperature through an average period of time, that difference in air temperature can be a lot more significant when we have colder temperatures. So 10 degrees Celsius might be 14 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit. I have to get out my calculator to figure that out. But that can be a really important difference when we have those cooler temperatures. So when we're looking at building our high tunnel, one thing to keep in mind, if you're not the most handy person, so if you're like me, There are kits available from a number of different retailers. So you can order a kit for a high tunnel that kind of comes with everything that you need. That frame material most of the kits is going to be made out of steel, though often a simple high tunnel can be built with PVC. The normal recommendation is to use 6 mil plastic sheeting. Some people do go down to a 4 mil plastic sheeting, though the experience that I've been told about is that oftentimes that lighter weight plastic is very prone to tearing, which means it needs to be replaced a good bit more often. Much like when we discussed greenhouses, it's important to consider the size of the high tunnel, what you're intending to grow, because it's a lot easier to start with the size that you need than to add on to it. And just as we mentioned for greenhouses, it's a lot easier to add on length than it is to add on width. So particularly, you want to make sure that you think about how wide that tunnel needs to be, how many rows of plants you're looking to get into there. And in particular, when you're thinking about height and width and the entrance you're going to use, if you're going to try to get machinery into that high tunnel, you want to make sure that it's going to be wide enough and tall enough that you're going to be able to do that. You can see those two fine gentlemen. That's Mike Ely and Thomas Freeman, who are kind enough to do all of the hard work in building the high tunnel that you see right there. That's at a location near Wiggins, Mississippi. They are hand laying that plastic mulch, but fortunately, there is a machine that does that that makes life a lot easier. So you certainly, if you have the ability to build a high tunnel, you can get that kind of machinery into. It's going to be very useful for you. If you're interested in building it yourself and buying all the parts, there is a really good breakdown of construction cost that is available at the link right there. Really kind of goes into detail for all of the parts you're going to need and what you're going to need to put it together, and kind of gives you an idea of the labor cost as well. So this is a picture of a high tunnel that's being built, really quite a large one. It's actually being built over the top of the crop that's already planted, but it kind of gives you an idea of the structure of the frame, which is that big metal sort of Quonset style. If you look at the kind of to the left side there, you see that bar that goes down. That is to get in the what's called wiggle wire that's going to attach that plastic over the top. One thing that you do want to be conscious of is that when you're getting the plastic on, as I was told, it's very frequent. That's when the wind is going to pick up. So that can be more of a struggle than any of the other aspects of getting the high tunnel put down. Here's a picture of the same high tunnel all closed up in November. So really effective and a nice high tunnel going over that strawberry production. Now, things don't have to be that complicated or that large. This is a low tunnel. It's put over some tomatoes being grown out in the field. And it really is just constructed of PVC that's been bent and then covered over with plastic. And you can see in this image, with the stick to hold it up and the PVC pipe there to hold that line up to get a little bit of increased time for getting those tomatoes to grow early in the year. So one of the things you really want to think about in high tunnel production is the use of irrigation. Of course, one of the advantages of having a high tunnel is that we're eliminating the moisture on the crop that would occur because of rain, and that reduces a lot of the potential for disease development, because disease development requires there to be moisture on the leaf for an extended period of time. So certainly it is possible, if you have a small high tunnel for personal use, to use hand watering inside of it. but I would highly recommend drip irrigation. That's going to be really effective. Um, it's going to deliver that water right down to the root zone, and because the water is being delivered just right there at the root zone, we're not putting water in other areas. That's going to help us reduce a lot of the weed pressure we would see inside the high tunnel as well. This is a great picture of, this is a mulch layer. So this lays, I mentioned the machine that's used to lay down that plastic mulch. This is a small version of that. What's notable is that it lays both the plastic as well as the drip line at the same time. So that roll that you see up at the top is the drip line that you would want to lay down in the middle of your rows. That goes under the plastic as the mulch layer kind of does that all at one time. And here you can see the plastic mulch that's being laid down. And of course, plastic culture in high tunnels is really effective. Provides a barrier between the plant and the soil, which again has a lot of benefits in disease reduction. Right. Of course, we also do need to fertilize inside our high tunnel. Water soluble fertilizers and compost have both been used for fertilizing in high tunnels. Now, again, we're not having any precipitation in there. So one thing we do want to keep in mind is that it is possible that through fertilization, we can get a buildup of salts in the soil in the high tunnel. So, for most instances, doing a soil test is going to be really important, and just using the lowest recommended rate we can to make sure that we have all of the nutrition that we need for the plants, and really avoiding that salt buildup as much as we can. One thing that I highly recommend for use in high tunnels is a fertigation system or a fertilizer injector. So you can see a picture of a small version of that just attached to a standard faucet or down at the bottom image. And so water runs into there, picks up the fertilizer, gets back out into the water system, and then that fertilizer is delivered right into the root zone again. And it really provides an effective way to get that fertilizer out there. Because we have an area where we're really actively and kind of aggressively growing, it is kind of demanding on our soils. We aren't getting any nutrient leaching, and that can lead to a kind of loss of soil structure. So it's important to add organic matter, avoid over fertilization, and particularly I would recommend rotating crops on a regular basis just to avoid the buildup of any potential problems. We want to maintain good physical structure, make sure the pH and organic matter are right, not have any soil compaction, and the work that's been done on high tunnels suggests every few years you really need a good renovation tilling in order to help improve that soil structure, add in more organic matter, and address any compaction by turning over that soil really effectively. One thing that is important is we already have the high tunnel. We can use further season extension technologies. So raised beds and plastic mulches can both be used to allow us to reach higher soil temperatures earlier in the year. We can use row covers and thermal blankets or cold frames to help protect plant canopies from cold damage. And using these additional season extension technologies can give us another couple of weeks where we can get the plants into that high tunnel and really get the most use out of them. So this is a really good example where they've put in low tunnels over the crop in addition to the high tunnel they're already in, which is just going to give a lot of additional cold protection to that crop. You can see them opened up there and then closed down for the night. so that if you're in a situation where you're having a really cold day, closing both of those structures is really going to give you a lot of cold protection for that crop. This is another example that's an agricultural cloth that can be put over the plants. The name is escaping me for the moment, but this is put down over strawberries, just kind of laid down over the top of the crop, and is really effective again at providing an awful lot of cold protection. And they could maintain that. I was really interested here. They were concerned about fertilization, and they solved that problem by getting out there with a leaf blower to blow under the cloth to allow for the pollination to happen for that crop. So I thought that was a really interesting note. Some really important warm season crops we're going to be growing in high tunnels. Of course, tomatoes are kind of undoubtedly the most important and the most common. But we also see cucumber production and squash production, pepper production, even pole beans inside of high tunnels, all growing very effectively. Our winter vegetables, a lot of the lettuces and greens like spinach and kale and collards. One of my favorites is pak choy, but also Swiss chard. And I do know quite a number of people that grow various herbs in their high tunnels, really allow for some off-season production of those. This is an example. I mentioned being able to put in a high tunnel just using PVC rather than steel. So this is an example of what was kind of built as a temporary high tunnel. This was in March of 2019. That is Mr. Belcher pictured here. So they put in this kind of a temporary high tunnel over 2 rows. And you can see it finished there. Just the only wood components of that are the sort of the end frame that you see right there to allow for putting in the door. So a much sort of a more low cost kind of structure than you would see with some of the others that I've pictured. That being said, that was very effective at producing a change in the crop that's being grown. And I really like these pictures because they gave you a good idea of how that high tunnel affected plant growth. So you can see this is in sort of the middle to late part of April. But as we get into May, you can see a really significant difference in plant growth inside of the high tunnel and outside of the high tunnel. So those are coming up inside the high tunnel all the way to almost all the way to his shoulder, and then outside the high tunnel they're down just above his waist. So a really significant difference there. And this would be towards the end of tomato production for us. Of course, they've taken off the plastic now. You can see again the difference in the height of the plants. But one of the things that I thought was significant, we all struggle with early blight on tomatoes here in Mississippi. Really kind of a devastating disease for tomato production. And there was less early blight inside that tunnel area than there was outside. You can kind of, this is just another example of a high tunnel. You can see again, when they planted, able to harvest 2 to 3 weeks earlier, had taller plants and less early blight. One thing that I really like to bring attention to this, the high tunnel, you really want to maximize the space that you have available inside of there. As you get to the sides, because it's sort of the Quonset design of a high tunnel, so the sides or the edges are not going to be nearly as tall as the center is. You can see the squash plants. If you look on the left of the picture, squash plants put along the side of the high tunnel. That's both because they're a more low growing plant, so they're not going to be interfered with by the top of the high tunnel. And in addition, they of course benefit from pollination. So being able to roll up the sides and make sure that those crops are getting pollinated is really important as well. Just another great picture of some plants, some trellis plants there, some eggplants, and cucumbers growing inside a high tunnel. These are peppers. Of course, bell peppers are a really popular crop here in Mississippi. I enjoy them a lot, uh, and uh, and often I struggle with being patient to pick those first bell peppers. So you can see these really nice, mature, ready to harvest bell peppers on a plant on April 25th, which is really quite remarkable. Getting a little bit into fruit production, of course, we're going to go back to this image you saw earlier. This is strawberry production. Of course, it's on black plastic because really need that separation from the soil to prevent disease issues. You can see some of the varieties that were being grown, just for some nice, pretty picture of some good, healthy strawberries there. And then without getting too heavily into the numbers with you, looking at harvest, we can kind of compare the harvest inside and outside for the different varieties, and you can generally see that there was an increase in the amount of strawberries harvested inside the high tunnel when we compare that with what was harvested outside. And kind of another important note for that, you can look at how much of that crop was able to be harvested early, and what that really tells us is, again, we can get those crops out really fast, and because of being able to harvest it quickly, we can get it out at a time when we'd be able to get a premium price for it. Also mentioned earlier about protection from rain, and of course high tunnels are going to exclude that rain. And you can look at this as the percent that were marketable after a rain event for the different varieties. You can see, it's hard to argue with that first one there with Strawberry Festival, where they were all 100% marketable. But you do see some pretty significant declines, particularly on May 3rd there. See very much the same thing for the Camarosa variety, and for Sweet Charlie, particularly 513. You see a really significant reduction in how much of that crop was marketable. If you're not a producer, or rather, if you're not a someone who's selling their vegetables or fruit, you can still think about this as the fruit that you're going to be able to harvest and enjoy, that are going to be protected from the rain by adoption of this high tunnel. Another thing that I didn't even consider was protection from deer damage. So you can, of course, if you have an enclosed structure, the deer are going to be a little bit less prone to walking in, and we do often see some deer damage in some of our crops. Blueberries, another crop where we can really benefit from early production. April 13, selling at $37 a flat, then May 13 down to $24 a flat. So that's a $13 difference in value of that crop. And we also have to worry about early frost, because that can really significantly reduce our yield. If we get a frost in mid-April, the blueberries are flowering. We can damage those flowers, make it really hard to produce anything. So this picture is taken blueberry plants inside a high tunnel. This is going to be near Richton, Mississippi, so a little bit south of Laurel. And you can see they really good plastic down with the blueberries that are being grown in there. And then, of course, they have very similar to that the outside with the blueberries kind of planted the very same way. If we put the blueberries in high tunnels, we can increase their earliness. They did several years looking at the data, and I didn't include all the yield data for that. But we can get flowering earlier, get harvesting earlier by about 2 weeks for South High Bush, and then 1 to 2 weeks for Rabbit Eye varieties, and get a lot of frost and freeze production. Because what we don't want to happen is this. So these are some blueberry bushes that were outside, had a really serious cold event and killed all the plants. So having that cold protection can be really important. Just an example of some blueberries doing fantastic in a high cover situation. This is in Florida. Blackberry production is actually something that we want later in the season. Again, it's kind of the opposite. You know, in June, we're looking at $5 to $6 for a flat. As we're getting into the later part of the year, if we get to October, that price goes up to $20. So really significant difference in the value of production. Wichita and Natchez and several other varieties of blackberry were trialed inside high tunnels. Just to show you some pictures there. And I just briefly wanted to mention, because it is becoming significantly more popular, cut flower production is also being investigated in high tunnels. From the reading I've done on the topic, it's kind of dependent on the particular flower species, because it seems to have some effects on stem length and a few other factors that are really important for cut flowers. But I certainly think that this would be again, for a home grower, including including an area of cut flowers in your high tunnel is something you can really enjoy. For a producer, it's something that also represents a potential high value crop, something that we can get in there that can bring some more value to your production. Just very quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this. Generally speaking, we can think of high tunnels as providing some protection from some insect pests, and that's just because they form a barrier around the plant and keep the bugs from getting in. However, there are some insect pests that we really want to carefully consider when we're looking at high tunnels. And very often these are going to be the insect pests that are common in greenhouses. So things like thrips and aphids and whiteflies, as well as spider mites, are pests that we really want to pay attention to. Really important to monitor the plants inside those structures. And one of the things that's particularly notable is particularly for inside high tunnels where we have those warmer conditions, as the temperature increases, we can actually see the species of insects reproducing more frequently, getting to maturity a little bit faster, producing more eggs, and building up a higher population. So it is important to really monitor closely for the development of any populations. Generally speaking, adding in biological controls or releasing biological controls like lady beetles and things like that can be very difficult to apply out in the field, because the potential predator or other beneficial insect can simply disperse away from where you're trying to use it. Again, if you have that kind of enclosed structure, you can see a little bit more benefit potentially from the application of releases of biological control organisms, again, lady beetles or parasitoid wasps, things like that. So this is just an example of spider mite damage occurring inside of a high tunnel that can be really severe. And we normally do see spider mite damage when temperatures are high and we have dry weather, which is kind of going to be defining what we're going to be experiencing inside a high tunnel. So just to kind of give again, we can think about augmented biological control, where we're releasing beneficial insects like lady beetles or green lacewings or parasitoid wasps inside of the high tunnel to help with some of these insect pests. And they also have looked at using exclusion screens on the side. So even when you raise the top up or the sides up, there's a screen there that will bar out a lot of the pests that we would be worried about. There's some other effects of that we need to consider in terms of how it affects air movement and other things like that. So still something we're really working on, but definitely worth consideration. When we think about plant disease, again, we're seeing a good benefit in terms of excluding a lot of the problems. We're not having a long-term leaf wetness and things like that. But it is still really important to employ good sanitation, and that's just a lot of prevention, removing any of the plant material after harvest, um, removing any diseased plant tissue, not putting coal piles near the high tunnel so that we're not spreading any disease back in, taking care of any weeds so that they don't harbor any insect pests or pathogens that might spread into the plants in the high tunnel. Keep in mind, we do have high humidity inside of there because the plants are transpiring and letting loose water, so that humidity inside that high tunnel can increase fairly dramatically. So one thing that's beneficial is venting or raising the sides in the morning for 10 to 20 minutes. Let that really humid air out, and that'll help with disease control as well. And you just want to make sure, again, we control aphids and whiteflies in order to help prevent the introduction of viral diseases. And some of the common diseases that we see in high tunnels, like powdery mildew, are fungal diseases, but we also do occasionally see some of the more common viral diseases, like tomato spotted wilt or tobacco mosaic virus, as being serious problems in high tunnel production. So I really appreciate you being here and listening to this. I would be very thrilled to answer any questions that you might have about high tunnels or anything else. If you're watching on YouTube and you got to the end, thank you and appreciate it. And there's a little subscribe button and a like button down there. And I would appreciate you hitting that. That way you'll know about future videos that come out. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop.